And we're live.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our first Dialogues event for the winter quarter. Dialogues, Voices from Performance is a colloquium series which seeks to highlight the work of diverse artists, scholars, and activists in the fields of theater, dance, and performance studies. We're very excited to have all of you here. I would like to begin this event with a land acknowledgement to address the settler colonial context of the Indigenous territories where our gathering takes place, and to recognize Indigenous peoples' continued presence on stolen land. Please take some time to research the importance of land acknowledgements and figure out where you are today. Central Washington University acknowledges the people who have been on this land since time immemorial. The Ellensburg campus is on land ceded by the Pushwanapum and other bands and tribes of the Yakama Nation in the Treaty of 1855. The Yakama people remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it and protecting it as instructed by elders through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands and give thanks to the legacy of the original people, their lives, and their descendants. Today for Dialogues, we welcome Dr. Pierrot. Grégory Pierrot is an associate professor of English at the University of Connecticut at Stamford. He is the author of Decolonize Hipsters, The Black Avenger in Atlantic Culture, and co-editor of the forthcoming An Anthology of Haitian Revolutionary Fictions. He is also a translator and co-host of the Decolonize That webcast series with Bhakti Shringarpure. His writing has appeared in Africa is a Country, LA Review of Books, Libération, Public Books, Warscapes, and scholarly journals such as the African American Review, Criticism, Atlantic Studies, and more. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Pierrot.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all the people here today. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Dr. Lindsay, for inviting me, and thank you to Central Washington University for organizing this speaking series. So my talk today will be divided in two parts, roughly a fairly conventional presentation where I'll be making an argument about the theater of early independent Haiti, and the second, maybe more informal section where I'd be happy to say more about translating the play Neri, which I hear some of you have read in Dr. Lindsay's class, maybe saying more about Juste Chanlatte and potentially about translation, archival work, and answering questions maybe. On this note, I have to say before I get started, just how exciting it is to hear that you've been using the Neri website in class and reading the play. I was telling Dr. Lindsay earlier, it's rare when you meet people who use and read what you write. Not that it's rare that people do it, but you don't necessarily often talk about it. So it's really exciting for me, and I'm looking forward to a conversation. Okay, so let me see if I can share this. Okay. All right. So I will start with sort of obligatory historical background here regarding Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. So present-day Haiti is the western half of an island that was once called Quisqueya or Haiti by the Tainos, who lived there before Christopher Columbus first landed during his first voyage in 1492. Quisqueya is where he and his crew built the first European settlement and first permanent European city in the Americas. It is estimated that anywhere between 400,000 and 8 million people lived on the island before contact with Europeans. By the early 1520s, less than 10,000 of them remained, wiped out by Spanish violence, enslavement, forced labor, and diseases. The first decades of Spanish presence saw unrelenting resistance from Tainos, led by such figures as the cacique, there's the chief Anacaona that you see represented here on the right, and the other cacique, her nephew Enriquillo, or Henry, who led resistance against the invader from his mountain stronghold between the 1520s and 1530s, modeling strategy that the maroon community, so escaped enslaved people in later years, would soon develop on the island. On this topic, I'm just going to take a second to show you a book that is relevant to this conversation that some of you may have heard about, 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance. It's a comic book by Gord Hill. I highly recommend it. And he has a section on Henri Quillot. So just an aside. And so indeed, beginning as soon as 1503, Spaniards started deporting enslaved Africans to Quisqueya. But as local mines yielded less and less gold, the Spaniards lost interest in the island. Although they introduced the sugarcane there in 1510, and the plantations were flourishing, increased pirate activity and encroachment led the Spaniards to concentrate around the city of Santo Domingo in the east, leaving most of the island, especially the western part, open for pirates to use, and they use the island as a way station on their travels, and more specifically, at first, in any case, Tortuga, which you see here on the left. It's the island above Mole St. Nicholas. And Tortuga, if you read or like to watch pirate movies, you may have heard of it. That's where the Brethren of the Coast were based. The French eventually claimed control of the western third of the island, a de facto annexation recognized in 1697 at the Treaty of Brunswick, which granted French control over the territory they named Saint-Domingue. So Santo Domingo in the east is the Spanish side, and Saint-Domingue the French side. While the Spanish side of the island developed fairly slowly, Saint-Domingue soon became a hub of agricultural and economic activity, relying more than any other American colony on enslaved labor. Over the following century, it became the wealthiest colony in the New World, its sugar plantations outproducing all Spanish and English colonies combined. It was also a major producer of coffee and indigo. Under French control, over 800,000 enslaved people were deported to Saint-Domingue, almost twice the amount that would ever be deported to the United States. At the turn of the 1790s, about 450,000 enslaved people of African descent lived on the island for 30,000 whites and about 25,000 so-called gens de couleur, or free people of color. So I want to take a minute here to maybe say a little more about what this term covers. What was meant by gens de couleur, or free people of color, it was a social racial category that also had legal existence in the French colonial system. It's a somewhat misleading term that designates all free people of African descent, whether they'd originally been kidnapped into slavery in Africa and had somehow obtained freedom in the colonies, or if they were born of enslaved parents in the colonies and then emancipated, or if they were born free of free people of color, right? All of these were gens de couleur. And so, the reason I insist on this might seem obvious, but very often you see in texts of the 18th and 19th century that the term gens de couleur was used, as if it were synonym with the term mulatto, which was a term drawn from the racial taxonomy developed in the colonies to describe every possible combination of blood. And this is what those graphs represent. Right? It's fairly, mind-boggling blood taxonomy, with the blood quantum that you see here, that to define every possible shade and combination. And so the reason I insist on this is that it sounds that it describes biological nature, but of course it's very ascientific. Right? The term gens de couleur indicated free status for people of African descent, no matter what their skin color or social status. So you could be a servant, a barber, an artisan, or even a slave-owning planter. And there were quite a few free people of color who were planters and who owned slaves, and notably specializing in the culture of coffee, and for example, but they were all considered part of that same class, right? Gens de couleur. They might be wealthy or not, but in the social racial organization of the colony, they were by design kept on a lower rung than any white person. So you could be have much more money than the next white person, but that social racial organization meant that you had to behave respectfully towards them and act according to specific laws that only applied to gens de couleur. Those laws got increasingly harsh throughout the 18th century, controlling every aspect of the social lives of free people of color. They could hold no governmental offices or commanding position in militias, even though they were expected to serve on militias. Laws also regulated their clothes, what clothes they could wear, how they should be addressed, how they should address other people, and where they could sit in public spaces. And we'll get back to that when I start talking about playhouses. You see a quote here from Marlene Dout's Tropics of Haiti, a book which, by the way, you should read it's pretty big, but it's well worth it. And the reason I singled out this quote is she makes a very useful point regarding the way these notions of race pervaded culture and thought, and including the culture and thought of people most concerned. And in many ways, I think we see remnants of those ideas to this day. We often speak of pseudoscience or scientific racism to describe what happens during the 18th century. I want to say we have to keep in mind that this type of blood logic was widely accepted as scientifically true by many people at the time, including many free people of color, who considered themselves often fundamentally different from both Black and white people. Again, here as elsewhere, I don't want to generalize, it wasn't the case of everyone, but this logic pervaded the society and controlled many aspects of society. So whether or not they agreed, these were terms and understandings that would be used even by people who were against them, right? So as an aside. And so this becomes very important at the turn of the, in the late 1780s. In July 1789, the French Revolution begins. That would end up toppling the monarchy and install a republic for a while. Among the people who witnessed the taking of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, and other early developments and debates in the revolution was free man of color Vincent Auger, whom you see here on the left, a wealthy planter from Saint-Domingue. And so very often free people of color of wealth would send their sons to get education in continental France, because as weird as that may sound, racial prejudice there was much lesser than in the colony. They could not get decent education in the colony, where it was basically forbidden. So they would send them to France, and people traveled fairly often. So Auger was on such a trip when the revolution started. And he came back, he heard and read and participated in early debates around the rights of man. He was there when the French National Assembly was discussing new civil rights. And he and other free people of color started advocating for the civil rights of their social racial class, demanding that they be granted the same rights as any other free persons. In Paris, though, the planters and pro-slavery lobby also worked very hard to defend slavery and influence conversations. Right? So, many parties were involved in early revolutionary discussions. But Auger came back from France to Saint-Domingue, thinking that new decisions in France actually applied to him and gens de couleur in the colony. So he came back claiming that local authorities should be granting free people, right? He was not talking about the enslaved, but free people of color the same rights as white people. And he determined to take up arms if denied. His demands were met with absolute refusal from local authorities and staggering violence by the white population on the island. There were the massacres of people of color, and Auger himself was captured and gruesomely executed in 1790. In the aftermath of these events, free people of color on the island formed into militias and started defending themselves against their enemies, and the fights sort of broke out throughout the island. About a year later, in August 1791, following the Vaudoune ceremony at Black Avenger, which is represented here on this painting, the enslaved population in the north revolted to gain their own freedom. Over the following 13 years, the conflict would see alliances between different parties in presence shift with a few mainstays. So the enslaved were obviously fighting for their freedom, sometimes against free people of color, sometimes against white people, sometimes alongside both those groups or factions within these groups. Free people of color were fighting for their own civil rights, though not necessarily against slavery. And the local white population was trying to defend the old order, while white Republican representatives from France would come over defending the Republic against royalists. It's very complicated. I will not necessarily get into details right now, but you want to think of all those factions sort of moving and striking short alliances with each other against main foes, right? The whole time with Spain on the east and English islands all around. This becomes especially important when in 1792, France is suddenly at war with all of Europe, right? All of royalist Europe fights France on the continent, but obviously also in the Caribbean. And in 1793, Great Britain launches a gigantic attack on French possessions throughout the Caribbean, and notably Saint-Domingue, where they land in 1793. So they land there in the middle of the revolution. So you see how complex that gets, right? And those alliances also shift. Again, I'll spare you the details for now, but if you're interested, I can say more about it later. Faced with fighting that English invasion, supported by white planters, but also, fighting the enslaved in revolt, French Republican representatives abolished slavery in the colony in 1793. So the thinking was fairly clear, right? They realized they could not win by themselves. And so the representative Sontonex figured that if he abolished slavery, then a lot, the armies of formerly enslaved people might join the French side. He was right for some of them, especially for one of them, a rising officer known as Toussaint Louverture. That decision, the abolition of slavery, here we go. That decision, the abolition of slavery, turned the tide of the war against Great Britain. Toussaint Louverture brought the armies of formerly enslaved along with him, united them. And on the other side, you had André Rigaud, a free man of color who was leading the armies of his social racial class in the South. The two of them managed to force the British to withdraw from the island in 1798. And just, a little bit of background for both of them, because that's also important. Toussaint Louverture was born enslaved on the island, gained freedom in the 1770s, but he was a leader of the slave armies, right? Rigaud was born free, and he was leading armies of Jean de Cuda, and that's important, and we'll see why in a few minutes. The peace that followed the withdrawal of the British was short-lived. Because in its aftermath, Louverture and Rigaud, the two most prominent island-born officers, fought a bitter civil war for supremacy on the island. Rigaud and his supporters were forced to flee the island in 1800, leaving Louverture the governor-general of the colony. In continental France, fairly similar things were happening when General Napoleon Bonaparte was in a similar position, having overthrown the government in November 1799. He became the first consul of France and turned it into a dictatorship before becoming the emperor in 1805. 1804, sorry. A deeply prejudiced man who surrounded himself with representatives of the Planter Party, Bonaparte decided to re-establish slavery, taking advantage of a rare peace with Great Britain in 1801. At that point, he sent a massive expedition led by General Leclerc to the Caribbean to re-enslave the local population. The War of Independence, Toussaint Louverture was captured, sent to die in a jail in the Alps in France, but the war didn't stop there, right? The war, what became at this point a War of Independence, saw the French army commit unbelievable atrocities against the civilian population, a behavior that contributed to reunite former supporters of Rigaud and former supporters of Louverture against the French. The French were soundly beaten at the Battle of Vertières in November 1803, and their armies withdrew from the island without formal surrender, most of them leaving on ships that were immediately captured by Great Britain. And Great Britain at this point was supporting the Haitians. leaders of the indigenous army behind General Jean-Jacques Dessalines declared independence and named the country Haiti in reference to its pre-Columbus name on January 1st, 1804. That independence, needless to say, was not recognized by French authorities. And in fact, about 2,000 French soldiers left not the island, but to the Spanish side, where they would stay for a few years, rather than surrender. Thousands of civilians followed them to Santo Domingo. And, at that time, they were still hoping that once again, French troops might be sent so they could recover their possession in Haiti. In the same time, a lot of French civilians remained in Haitian cities, right, after independence. In this context, their presence made for a volatile situation because, of course, for a decade before that, they had constantly contributed to undermine the revolution, right, which Haitians knew fairly well. So, even after independence, the situation was very volatile. And independence did not guarantee that the country would exist, especially not at the beginning. So that was sort of a long introduction leading to this point, right? But one thing that I'm especially interested in is that in the early days, from the early days of independence, theater played a rather interesting and unexpected, maybe, part in local politics. So I want to start with a little anecdote here. A few weeks into Haitian independence, in January 1804, a civilian Frenchman escaped from the southern Haitian city of Jérémie, boarding an English frigate remaining in the harbor. So remember, England was very close to Haiti, even though even England did not recognize Haitian independence. Among those Frenchmen was a French-born officer who had officially become Haitian on defecting from the French army and joining Jean-Jacques Dessalines' indigenous army. On the occasion of a theatrical performance, he ordered the soldiers, usually in charge of customs duty, to act as a police force at the Jérémie Playhouse, allowing him and his accomplices to leave undetected. Right, so the theatrical play allowed him to escape. General Ferrou, who was the commander at Jérémie, demanded from the English ship captain to return that French officer so he could be court-martialed. The ship captain, Parkins, refused, but he needed to get water on the island, right? So he sent a few sailors to get water, and those sailors were captured by the Haitians, who basically bargained and saying, well, you'll get your sailors back if you send that French officer back. So he did, and the French officer was executed for treason because, of course, he had become Haitian at that point, right? That episode bolstered suspicions of Haitians toward Frenchmen in their midst. It also fueled rumors that a conspiracy to foment revolt against the new authorities was afoot. All of this, in turn, contributed to the new governor, General Jean-Jacques Dessalines' order to resume war against the French remaining in Haiti in February of 1804. So that's where Jérémie is, you see on the southwestern tip of the island. So in his proclamation of April 28, 1804, Dessalines justified the order to attack the remaining French with this question. Shall I again recall to your memory the plots lately framed at Jérémie, the terrible explosion that was to be the result, notwithstanding the generous pardon granted to these incorrigible beings at the expulsion of the French army? So the Jérémie incident I just talked about that happened during a theatrical performance was an early clue that the country's national identity and future might be symbolically decided in the playhouse. And that's the argument I'm making anyway. Where Haitian elites created and projected idealized images of Haitian citizens for domestic but also international consumption. I also take this episode as a kind of metaphor for the issue that French influence represented in the fledgling Haitian culture. So French, of course, was constitutive and potentially deceitful, yet unavoidable part of Haitian culture, right? They spoke French, wrote in French, educated Haitians did in any case. But then again, the French language was not just the language of the former oppressor and the language of literate education. It was also the language of international diplomacy in the early 19th century. And as such, it was a necessary tool for international relations. So, French had this, oversized presence and problematic presence in early Haitian culture. It was also not the first language of most Haitians, and that's the last point I want to make in this introduction. Most Haitians actually spoke Creole, a language that was then widely derided and understood by most people as a simplified, corrupted version of French. All these issues were central at a time when literature was part of the young nation's defense arsenal. In the words of Haitian historian Enoch Trouillot, literature was a shield raised for the liberated race, with all authors having in common a homeland and rights to defend against white racism. So I want to try to map out in my presentation a few of the stakes of that moment and see how those matters of culture, of literature, of language and politics sort of emerged, especially around the theater. So, okay. So the theater, I'm going to backtrack historically just a little bit. The theater occupied an important place in the cultural life of colonial Saint-Domingue. On the eve of the revolution, all major cities in the colony had playhouses. There were 8 of them, boasting programs worthy of their Parisian counterparts. The buildings and their stages mirrored, reproduced, but also mocked and twisted the rules of a slaveholding society, increasingly bent on enforcing social racial hierarchies. And I'm showing here the Plan Méplé, which is the only existing a plan of a Saint-Domingue playhouse. This is the playhouse that was in Port-au-Prince, the current capital of Saint-Domingue. And so you can see different sections of the playhouse. The letters, correspond to balconies and lodges. Some of them, reserved for notables and military officers, et cetera, et cetera. For our purpose here, I'll just point to section N, which you see here around, circling the place. It's a balcony, right, in case that's not clear. And that is the section that was reserved for free people of color. So that's the only place at Port-au-Prince where they were allowed to sit. Similar organizations were, you could find similar organization in all the playhouses on the island. They might have looked differently, but similarly, seating was segregated. As noted by UGA Press, there was then a widespread notion that the theater could Europeanize or civilize both the white and free-colored population of the island, saving the whites from degeneration and elevating people of color above their original barbarity. Part of this education, as it happens, and this is my argument, was in the pseudoscientific fiction of race, right? Because this was a place where, again, segregation was physically and visually enforced. A central element of the colonial culture, it was made true in its performance, and the theater played a crucial part in constituting, circulating, and maintaining the terms of the fiction of race throughout the colonial world. If the world is a stage, stages also make the world, right? And Saint-Domingue stages helped shape and conceptualize Saint-Domingue's social life, but simultaneously enforcing, but also flouting the color line. The theater was a space where social racial rules were put on display, performed, but also bent and flouted. As Jean Fouchard has shown, in the decade before the beginning of the revolution, the Saint-Domingue theater had begun to develop a unique blend of French theatrical conventions and Saint-Domingue particularisms, including Creole, as well as local musical styles and dances in performances. By the late 1780s, artists of African descent were performing on Saint-Domingue stages variations of local songs and dances as they were reinterpreted by French or white Creole stage directors. In some cases, they brought Creole onto the stage, albeit generally for comic relief. In this way, I would go as far as arguing that performances on the Saint-Domingue stage predated and announced blackface minstrelsy, in the US and later on throughout the world, introducing its grammar, so to speak, by featuring white people in makeup performing their versions of authentic Black music, dances, and speech, and creating conventions in the process that Black performers themselves would then have to follow. So early on, there were no Black performers on the Saint-Domingue stage. It's only in the 1780s that they started appearing as musicians, dancers, and sometimes actors. But by the time they get to the stage, they have to do what people expect of stage actors, including in the way they act themselves, right? Some of these performances traveled to continental France. And I want to see here, and that's the image here, similar developments were occurring in English theater as well, right, around the same time. And this image here is an engraving representing English actor Charles Dibdin in the 1768 play The Padlock, which featured him acting out in blackface the character of Mungo, a West Indian servant, an act that became so popular that by the 1780s, Dibdin had expanded it into a one-man show, right? So again, very quick nod towards the long history of minstrelsy and long and international history of minstrelsy. But so the Playhouse in Cap, the most prestigious on the island, was destroyed during the revolution, but theater lived on anyway, especially in the southern cities of Jérémie and Caille. Performances that continued throughout the decade of conflict, and local actors playing a repertoire made up of adaptations of old French plays, comedies, pantomimes, and material inspired by current events. During the French Revolution, a new style of theatrical performance sort of started that you might call news plays, right? They were very short plays inspired by current events, new battle, political decisions, etc. And a similar style developed in Saint-Domingue during the Revolution. With emancipation came performers of all backgrounds, but theater still remained the domain of the elite. Right? Among playwrights and actors were men who would occupy the highest functions of the state when independence came. Okay, so I mentioned Haitian factions battled each other during the Civil War. Rigaud on one side, Louverture on the other, free people of color, formerly enslaved people, generally speaking, and they reconciled in order to fight the French. But none of these former enemies had forgotten the past, and many Southerners, for example, still held in horror the name of Dessalines for the way he had acted during the Civil War. Although former Rigaud supporters signed on when he proclaimed himself Emperor of Haiti in 1805, they were already maneuvering to get rid of him. Historian Thomas Madieu tells us that in 1804, concerts and melodrama composed by young Haitians about the principal episodes of the National War were performed in Port-au-Prince. Enthusiastic, lively crowds came to watch, prominent officers sitting among them. So everybody was going to the theater. These plays, for the most part, have been lost, but Hénan Trouillot, the historian, also says that we can imagine that the hushed secret wars between factions were equally reflected in this literature. Chelsea Stieber, in her book Haiti's Paper War, another book I recommend, talks about Dessalines' short tenure at the head of the country and says that it was marked by constant internal tension between Dessalinians in the north and former Rigaud supporters in the south, with each group vying to define the post-independence future of Haiti. As it happens, some of the most prominent figures of Rigaud's party were also involved in early Haitian theater, either as sponsors, like General Nicolas Geffrard, who, the military commander in the South, or as actors, like Generals Guy-Joseph Bonnet and Pierre-Charles Lys, both of whom had only returned to the island after Dessalines sent out a call for all exiles to return. So remember, they left the island along with other Rigaud supporters when they lost the Civil War. The earliest Haitian play yet to have been recovered is L'Haïtien expatrié, written by Pierre Flignot and first performed in November 1804 in the southern city of Caille, weeks after Dessalines' coronation as Emperor Jack I. Sorry, that was 1804. The play opens as Alix, a free man of color and Creole from Saint-Domingue, forced to abandon his homeland because of the Leclerc expedition, disembarks in the Danish colony of St. Thomas. There he meets and befriends Lindor, an African-born man who also escaped Saint-Domingue at the end of the war in the south. in which he fought on Rigaud's side. The conflicts of the revolution forced both of them into exile, but St. Thomas is no refuge. The local administration considers them too enlightened to live with our people. And you have to remember, St. Thomas, of course, the Danish colony, is still a slave colony in 1803. As they prepare to face the hostility of Danish colonial authorities in the play, Lindor and Alex find out that the French have been defeated. No longer fugitives, they can now go back home and become Haitians. And I quote from the play, "May heaven let the telling of our story prove to every Haitian that he must expect safety only from his country." This is, Alex's last night in the play, right before they both take a ship back to Haiti. So the reason I mentioned this play, beyond it being the oldest play in existence, I think it sort of illustrates what I think is a crucial point about early theater in Haiti. And I'm quoting French philosopher Alain Badiou here, who says that if there is some truth to the commonplace that politics is theater, it is rather the opposite that is the case. Of all the arts, theater is the one that most insistently stands next to or supposes politics. A theatrical performance, according to Badiou, participates in the building of the state, particularly in the way it transforms revolution. And so I keep quoting, "Theater has always treated the revolution as a myth. Let me add in passing that this does not prove that it was a myth, but only that in theater, that part of the revolution that was not a myth cannot be represented." So heavy quote, but the way I interpret this is that part of the myth represented in this play I'm talking about, necessary for the building of the state, is the myth of a united nation, for example. So it is written by someone who seems very well aware of the factional disputes in Haiti between former Rigaud supporters and Dessalines supporters. And those disputes will lead to the assassination of Dessalines in 1806. But that play cannot afford describing those disputes. It needs to present Haiti as a united nation. So this is what it represents. The myth would be shattered less than 2 years later when a coalition made up mostly of former Rigaud officers would organize a military revolt against Dessalines and assassinate him. But more tellingly, perhaps, the more profound division ignored by early Haitian theater was that non-mythical part of the revolution. The thinking, the action, and the culture of the Haitian masses as opposed to the elites, right? All the more avoided here that they really literally did not speak the same language. So I mentioned before, right? The theater that I'm talking about is written in French by people who, for the most part, were educated in France, right? Free people of color, free-born free people of color. This is not the language that most of the people even going to those places, we can imagine, actually spoke. And so for Haitian historian Jean Casimir, the Haitian state was formed, and I quote, as a structure situated outside the local political community. It lacked the kind of political body that is the prerequisite for any form of lived citizenship. In these circumstances, the only kind of citizenship that could bud was ceremonial. Right, so his argument is that the people who ended up building the Haitian state, this elite was so far from the masses of Haitians that they built a state that did not overlap the nation. Right, early Haitian theater, produced by the same elites in control of the Haitian state apparatus, helped conceive the terms of this ceremonial citizenship and circulate it not just in Haiti but around the world. The commitment to popular sovereignty expressed in the government's official communications, decrees, and constitution, imbued with the egalitarian language of the French Revolution, was, according to Casimir again, limited to the verbal framing of legal texts, a declaration of intent with little application in Haiti's political life. Power and governance belonged to the army, and commanding officers formed the country's new elites. This was true of legal texts, but my argument here is that we can also see this in theatrical texts. And often they happen to be written by the same people. The plays of early independence were among the means of disseminating visions of a state system in the making. These visions developed in a double contrast to the former French colonizers, but also to cultural forms markedly linked to the formerly enslaved. Right. So again, I hope I'm not belaboring the point, but There was France and the French culture that, basically trained the people writing those texts. And while they write in reaction to them, they also write to distance themselves from the culture of a majority of the people that were enslaved until the revolution, right? Okay. Many of the plays performed in Port-au-Prince under Dessalines belonged to the French repertoire. For example, General Lee Saint-Bonnet, who I evoked earlier, acted on stage the roles of Cassius and Brutus, murderers of Caesar, in Voltaire's La Mort de César, the death of Caesar. Talk about foreboding. Those two generals acting on stage as elite Republicans who conspired to kill a populist autocrat. They did this on stage, and months later, they and their allies reprised their roles in real life when they overthrew and assassinated Dessalines. The Republican faction in Haiti cast Haiti as the lone remaining instantiation of the values of Enlightenment liberalism and republicanism that metropolitan France had failed to secure. So, as I mentioned earlier, France at the same time is also an empire. Napoleon overthrew the Republic and became a dictator. In Haiti, Republicans sort of, again, put themselves in contrast to Napoleon and France, but also by overthrowing Dessalines and claiming, Republican values. In the process, they effect a peculiar feat of time bending, right? Returning the empire to a rightful Republican regime that it had actually never known, right? I mean, between independence and Dessalines' coronation, Haiti is not a republic, right? They may wish that it were, but it isn't. It only becomes a republic after Dessalines dies. But for these people, it's almost like as if it was being returned to its rightful state. Okay. Oops, sorry. So in the aftermath of Dessalines' death in October 1806, Haiti split in two. In the south, the Republic of Haiti, led by General Alexandre Pétion, on your left here, and in the north, the state of Haiti, led by General Henry Christophe, who would be crowned as King Henry I in 1811. After an initial battle, the two states settled in hostile coexistence, and they still had to face a more existential threat. Although the United Kingdom had supported its bid for independence and remained its foremost commercial and diplomatic partner, it had not recognized Haiti as an independent country. The importance of this gesture, or lack thereof, became painfully clear when Napoleon abdicated in 1814 for a little while, and Louis XVIII came back to France to reclaim the French throne. Himself surrounded by advisors beholden to the plantocracy, Louis XVIII considered plans to try and recover the former colony. So, just again for background and quickly, Louis XVIII returned for a few months, then Napoleon came back, took over France again for 100 days, right, before he was defeated at Waterloo and kicked out for good, and Louis XVIII came back. But in this first time when Louis XVIII came back, one of the first things he looked at were possible plans to recover Haiti. And during that time, it seemed very likely that the French would launch another expedition against Haiti. So during this time, King Henry I in the kingdom in the north launched an ambitious public relations campaign. Having only unofficial access to diplomatic networks, as I said, the country was not recognized as such, he resorted to engaging Haiti's foes in the court of public opinion through very public correspondence with famous English abolitionists William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson and others, but also by flooding the European press with publications written by the kingdom's foremost authors. Put this up here. So starting in 1814, pamphlets, counter pamphlets, newspapers, all sorts of texts written in Haiti were printed, at the court of Henry and sent to agents, friends in Great Britain, so they could mention them in newspapers there and around Europe. And so all those prints were relayed by abolitionists in Great Britain. The point was to try to alert Europe to France's plan at a time when Great Britain had abolished the slave trade and was sort of making a big point out of this, right? The idea was a public relations campaign to alert Europe to, France's efforts at continuing the slave trade. And it's in that context that early on publications were generally political and historical pamphlets, but in the last years of the reign of King Henry, there was a turn from these to more overtly artistic and cultural production. And it's in that context that the plays I'm going to talk about were produced. So England was the principal economic and political partner of the Kingdom of Haiti, but it was careful not to grant the new country official diplomatic recognition. As Thomas Clarkson, the abolitionist, explained in his correspondence with King Henry I, Great Britain would not recognize independence unless the French did it first, in order not to offend the neighbor or undermine King Louis XVIII's shaky credibility. Placating the King of France was higher on Great Britain's list than supporting the King of Haiti. Still, many British priorities at that matched Haiti's priorities. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars in June of 1815, Great Britain was the uncontested master of the Atlantic. Great Britain bolstered this military status by exploiting its involvement in the general abolition of the slave trade. So as early as 1814, Great Britain proposed that the Allies, so all European countries fighting France, grant each other reciprocal right of visit on transatlantic ships in order to enforce the slave trade ban. England was powerful enough to force quite a few European countries to also ban the slave trade. But as you see, they also used that pretext to give themselves the right to accost any European ship on the Atlantic, or they tried to in any case. At the Congress of Vienna, which ended in June 1815, not long before the Battle of Waterloo, European powers nevertheless granted France 5 extra years of slave trade because of the early abolition. But Great Britain obtained to make the abolition of slavery part of European public law. It's a little bit complex, but that's the context for the second convention in 1818. Right, the Congress, the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle, in which Haitian diplomacy finally met some success in Europe. So as I said, they weren't recognized as an independent country by anyone, but they didn't stop them to ask people to speak on their behalf. And one of these persons was the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. He took it upon himself to intercede in favor of the Kingdom of Haiti, presenting Tsar Alexander I of Russia with a letter he had received from King Henry. The Tsar was very impressed. Clarkson said in his own letter back to Haiti that Alexander I found that this letter of genius and talent contained wise, virtuous, and liberal sentiments. And these had given him new ideas, both with respect to Haiti and to the government of Haiti. The Tsar further expressed, and I'm quoting, that he hoped that he should see the spectacle of a new empire rivaling the whites in all that was great and good. This arguably meant cultural production, and the court of Henry was happy to deliver. In Haïti Reconnaissant, the pamphlet here, a pamphlet published in 1818 to express gratitude for an abolitionist publication printed earlier that same year, Juste Chanlatte argued in defense of Great Britain's abolition of the slave trade, it is better to ensure supremacy in trade with the entire world by the power of one's good deeds than to shrink the sphere of one's activity in order to exercise tyrannical authority. So he's referring, of course, to the sort of moral superiority that the abolition of the slave trade gave Great Britain at that time. What he's saying also is that this position, of course, guaranteed them economic benefits, notably in trade with Haiti. He also wrote that Great Britain had found in the Haitian market and Haitian buying power an inexhaustible spring, a brilliant mine to exploit. Indeed, both Haitis gave Great Britain preferential treatment for commerce, and they also sought out other potential partners and still diplomatic recognition. So for the elites ruling Haiti, their best bet to achieve this goal was to build a nation state comprehensible to Europe. Economically, this meant continuing the trade in sugar, indigo, and coffee that the island had been known for as a slave colony. In the absence of official diplomatic recognition, trade relations were the closest thing to recognition for the empire and now the two states. This also meant demonstrating that Haiti was culturally worthy, right? And so here I'm focusing on another of Chanlatte's metaphors from the same pamphlet. Early in the text, a text that's addressed to virtuous philanthropes and illustrious writers of all countries, Chanlatte exclaims, "Shall I dip my brushes into the stream of memory and let them paint the emotions that agitated the soul of our august monarch on reading this publication?" So remember, he's talking about a pro-abolitionist print. "Our language cannot possibly displease you, nor be misunderstood by soul as sublime as yours. For ours is the language of gratitude and sensibility known by all peoples and countries. We will be glad if its sweet influence scatters a few precious bits along this text, like the river Pactolus carries along its path flakes of the finest gold." So those of you who have read Neri, you might recognize this very flowery sort of classical style of Chanlatte and his metaphors. It's fairly typical, and maybe we can talk about that later. But it also illustrates a realization central to this latter wave of publications from Haiti. The fact that cultural production was one of Haiti's most important exportation product, or could be, a resource just as valuable as gold, in that it had the potential to demonstrate to foreign heads of state the existence and value of the Haitian nation itself. Elites in the two Haitis calculated that circulating Haitian cultural achievements expressed in familiar tones and conventions might convince European nations of Haiti's worth. So if French theater could be civilizing, supposedly, surely Haitian civilized behavior could be demonstrated through through the Haitian theater. Okay. There would be much to say about theater in the two Haitis. I do in an article that's going to be part of an upcoming volume about Haitian literature at Cambridge University Press. Here I will focus on the theater of the kingdom, and more specifically the works of Juste Chanlatte. So I've mentioned him already. Just for background, Juste Chanlatte was very early in the revolution, a prominent figure among free people of color. He started fighting in the early 1791, but he started writing as well. So he was very well known as a pamphlet writer, even during the revolution. At the end of the revolution, he'd gone into exile also, like many free people of color. He came back and immediately became a secretary to Emperor Dessalines. When Dessalines died, Juste Chanlatte joined Christophe in the north and became secretary to Christophe, and also when Christophe became king. And so in the kingdom, theater was part of the state apparatus. The kingdom boasted a théâtre royal, so I'm putting here pages from the Royal Almanac, including the page describing members of the royal troops. This was a troop made entirely up of courtiers and playing for their majesty's pleasure and for the perfection of art. So the list of people here were all dignitaries from the kingdom, including Chanlatte himself. Theater in the kingdom mirrored in drastic manner the gap between the ruling elites and the Haitian masses. Indeed, according to W. Harvey, who was a British observer who was present, who visited the court during the kingdom period, Henry's aristocratic troop deemed it beneath their dignity to descend to the capacity of players unless at the instance of their master. So apparently the troop only performed at the court for the king, his courtiers and notable foreign guests, except on rare occasions. So during a tour throughout the eastern part of the kingdom in January 1814, for example, the Théâtre Royal performed French plays once popular in colonial Saint-Domingue for assembled guests and the local population. Henry also saw the theater as, again, part of a way for the kingdom to engage with its population and the king to engage with his subjects. He had a theater built outside of his capital in Cap that was meant for the entertainment of the common people. But here, again, also we get from Harvey that apparently the king's subjects, though they were very fond of Haitian productions about Haiti, had absolutely no interest in seeing the king's troupe perform plays drawn from the French repertoire. So there were, again, even though that was the more dignified and highbrow thing to do, a French theater, Haitians themselves didn't care much for it. I think this sheds some light on the background to Chanlatte's first forays into the theater. He wrote 3 plays in quick succession, L'Entrée du Roi en sa capitale, which you see here on the left, in the epic drama Néri, chef des Haïtiens, and finally, La Partie de chasse du Roi. I'm going to mostly focus on the first 2 today. So we don't have an actual publication date for L'Entrée du Roi en sa capitale. The subtitle here mentions January 1818, but that's part of the title, right? It's unclear. We may think that the play was actually performed on that date, but we don't exactly know. What I speculate is that it was actually produced in the aftermath of Thomas Clarkson's exchange with Tsar Alexander at Aix-la-Chapelle. English officials avoided addressing Henry as king in official documentation, as doing so would amount to a tacit recognition of independence. But in contrast to this, Chanlatte's plays represent an effort at reaching the same result by way of the stage. So what I'm trying to argue here is that while newspapers and official documents in England didn't necessarily call Henry king, by having this play where he is the king and circulating this play around the world, it would put the word out there, if you will, in public mind as opposed to official mind, let's say. And so portraying the wealth of Haitian culture in theatrical form, Chanlatte offered precisely the spectacle of a new empire rivaling the whites that Tsar Alexander so wished to see. So about this play, L'Entrée du Roi has a very simple plot. It's kind of a pageant, right? The setting is, on January 1818, to celebrate the anniversary of the independence of Haiti, King Henry prepares to visit his city of Cap. And so in the play, we see a group of inhabitants of Cap from a variety of social categories speak to each other about the upcoming visit, about living in the kingdom, and sing in praise of living in the kingdom and in praise of Henry's rule. And the play ends as the king appears on stage, the entire cast sings, and that's the end, right? That's pretty much the entire play. It is a 1-act opera vaudeville, a genre that was very popular at the time, in which humorous dialogues alternate with songs that often propose new lyrics to melodies that were already familiar to the audience. And so we know that this play was performed by the royal troupe, including Chanlatte himself, who played the role of Damis, the court poet, a fairly obvious alter ego and spokesman for the author. In one scene, one of Henry's courtiers thus praises Damis's craft, and I'm quoting my own translation. Heroes do great deeds, but it is thanks to literature that their names and works pass into the most remote posterity. The ever humble Damis responds, I'll cultivate with care for my homeland and my king this precious art, thanks to which great men act and speak long after they have ceased to live. So elsewhere in the play, Damis does just that, right? He quotes verbatim from speeches and laws written by Henry, not unlike Chanlatte himself did in many other pamphlets, right? So he does in the play what he thinks he does for a living, right? He shapes posterity. He is the one who chooses what to quote, when and where. And in this sense, the poet, who's also a man of state, is quite literally an architect of the monarchy. But one thing that's interesting in the play is that it also argues that he is not alone in doing this, right? I want to focus on 2 characters, the servant Valentin and his paramour Marguerite, who are arguably just as important in the play in doing the same thing. So one thing that's especially interesting about them, okay, so you see here, if you read French, that may be of interest. Otherwise, I'll just leave it up for illustration. Those characters speak in Creole in the play, echoing pre-revolutionary era, trends that I mentioned earlier that found inspiration in local language, customs, and behavior. Everybody else speaks French, right? Damis and his classical references highlight Haiti's belonging to the same familiar Western network of cultural references as European powers that Haiti meant to seduce, right? But with the characters of Valentin, we see a code-switching vernacular poet. right? And Chanlatte uses the principle of the vaudeville, the opera vaudeville form in order to showcase that the new nation has a unique culture and that might rival or indeed possibly best the culture of other white empires. So about that format, opera vaudeville relies on remixing and recycling, to use anachronistic terms, popular songs of the time. In this case, all those songs are borrowed from French music. So they use airs from famous revolutionary songs like Le Chant du Départ, but also from, for example, a song entitled Vive Henri IV, Long Live Henry IV, an old melody from the 1770s, praising the beloved French king from the 1600s, Henry IV. Chanlatte makes much of the two kings' names, Henry I of Haiti and Henry IV of France, asserting the popularity of the new one by evoking the old. And that's Henry I on the left and Henry IV on the right. But also suggesting in a rather tongue-in-cheek way that more than a repetition of the name, more than a cover of the song, this Haitian Henry was possibly more of a spiritual heir to the beloved French Bourbon king than his own descendant, Louis XVIII. In making this point, Chanlatte turns the defining elements of the vaudeville genre into a political tool. So to focus on this song, Vive Henri IV. I want to go back to this right here. It is the first song that's repurposed in the play, and it's in a scene where Valentin and Marguerite talk to each other. So the two represent the working class, the Creole-speaking working class, in a play otherwise performed in French. So this exchange, again, if you can look at it, it looks like French because the orthography was inspired by French, but it is really in Creole. And so the two have a discussion about the coming festivities, and Marguerite complains that she doesn't have a song to sing, her own song to sing. At which point, Valentin, her boyfriend and also a poet, reveals that he's written one for her. And he pulls out a note and hands it to her. And she says, oh, I know this air, right? He says that you have to sing it to the air of Vive Henri IV. And she says, oh, I know this song, but she also adds, I'll start learning the lyrics right away before our employers call us. And she looks and she says, but it's not in Creole. The lyrics are in French. And Valentin responds the following. Yes, because this way everybody will know that when Marguerite wants to, she can speak better French that misses syntax, right? By which is saying she can speak the most perfect French. The use of Creole emphasizes Haiti's national and linguistic particularities to domestic and foreign audiences. But Creole is the language of the poor, and as such, it is also coded as humorous and lesser than, right? Valentin is well aware of this. Like elsewhere in the play, he says that he believes people might think him stupid because, quote, his mouth isn't sweet and his language isn't golden. And some people make fun of him in the play, right? But what that scene implies really interestingly is that even the poorest of Haitians can not only invent songs in French, but also write and read them. Against all probability, right? Most formerly enslaved people were illiterate, obviously. But in the play, they can code switch and show up the most distinguished of speakers because in this moment of national celebration, the celebration of the king, syntax matters little. The appropriation of French song and the appropriation of the French language, its repurposing are all dedicated to the person of King Henry as incarnation of the state. Further yet, I would say in the context of the Congress of Aix that I mentioned earlier, this type of code switching and casual use of French gives the two characters an unspoken dimension as ambassadors for their country. French, as I mentioned, was the language of diplomacy, and now we see the most common Haitians wield it as good as a real ambassador will. In this way, Valentin's note, I would say, when he pulls it out, is almost a mirror of Henry's letter to Tsar Alexander. And again, that's interesting because most people believed, rightly or wrongly, that Christophe himself was illiterate. But of course, he sends this letter, sort of belying, at least symbolically, that idea. So here, to me, this scene sort of with Valentin and Marguerite echo the idea and also represent the potential of Haitian culture, not just for Haiti, but for the entire world. So L'Entrée du Roi is a pageant featuring characters representative of all Haitian walks of life, from servants to drug soldiers and aristocrats, each contributing their own paean to the monarchy. And that will be my last point on this play. What's also interesting is that one of the characters is an Englishman. He's featured in scene 5, and that's the page here. He is also a comedic character because his speech is also rendered with an accent. So only Marguerite, Valentin, and the Englishman have an accent in this play. And his accent is supposed to be a source of humor. It's rendered phonetically here. This English character is presented as, he was on the island, but instead of returning to London as he was planning to, he stays to witness the festivities and report on them to the King of England. Impressed by the proceedings, he means to contribute his own song. Remember, it's opera vaudeville, so everybody sings. And he has the following exchange with the Baron, and that's the page that you're seeing. And I quote, "It does not depend on me, nor on the relation I shall make to His Majesty the King, my master, that good intelligence and a perfect union shall reign between our two nations. Englishmen love sincerity and bravery, and the Haitian people possess these two virtues." The Baron says, "Oh, you are praising the two nations." And the Englishman responds, "It is my intention to compliment His Majesty." And to me, those lines pack rather radical implications. He's saying and implying that it is English public opinion, perhaps even more than the English king, that matters here. And that it is the English people that recognize their own affinity with the Haitian people. And in this, I think he also echoes something that had happened in 1814, when over 1 million English people signed a petition to the English Parliament protesting against this allowance I mentioned earlier that allowed France to practice slavery for another 5 years, right? Over 1 million people, which was would be a lot now, but was especially a lot at the time. So to me, all of these refer to sort of subtle ways in which, by way of the theater, the Haitian kingdom was hoping to maybe go over English authorities to speak directly or try to speak directly to the Haitian people. The Englishman's lines suggest that the English people had recognized Haiti already as an independent nation of kindred spirit in spite of the government's equivocation. So again, so saying, there's an equivalence between the two. All right. I'm moving on to the second play here, and the one that some of you might be more familiar with. I think something similar is strongly hinted in Néry, Chef des Haïtiens, Chanlatte's only drama, published in 1819. It is a very peculiar play that maybe you can talk about in more detail later, notably because it sets out not so much to rewrite history as to write myth in front of our eyes. And so I'm going to try to explain here. The play is a fanciful account of the resistance to the Napoleon expedition of 1802. And in this play, Lord Néry, sole commander of the Haitian army, manages to defeat the French, right? To defeat the French. Several elements of the play evoke the real-life circumstances of the Leclerc expedition in 1802. But the action takes place in Haiti, right? At a time when the country did not exist under this name. It also entirely erases the actions of, say, Toussaint Louverture, who was the actual commander on the island at the time, or of Jean-Jacques Dessalines and other major figures of the War of Independence. It does away with that entire conflict as well, of course. Between the time the French arrived and the end of the war, over a year actually expended, right? So in this opening scene in this play, Néry gives a speech to his officers before battle against the French. And this is what he says. "Here it is, this memorable time, when on this vast field, my downtrodden caste will avenge in full, in the eyes of the universe, so many awful insults, so many different offenses." He's saying that the whole world is watching, right? And the play, even though it was performed at Henry's court, was performed in the presence of English and American merchants, officers, and diplomats. So like the play itself, the line I just quoted speaks simultaneously of the past and the present, and of the political necessity to engage with the outside world through cultural production. Another aside, right? The title is usually, routinely presented as an anagram of King Henry's name, right? We find seemingly the same letters rearranged to sound different. Like nobody in the play has recognizable names except this one that looks familiar. But then it's a point I've made in several places. Henry actually wrote his name with a Y. Does it matter? Maybe, maybe not. But I would argue that maybe this is not quite Henry, the King of Haiti, right? Then the question might be, what is Neri the name of? And what I want to argue is that the play, it borrows elements not just from the Haitian Revolution, but of the entire history of the island. I mentioned earlier the Taino leader Henri Quillo, who was fighting the Spaniards in the 1500s. He was known as Henri on the French side of the island. Haitian historian Émile No asserts that King Henry was fascinated by this ancient predecessor with a namesake as a model of resilience, resistance, but also one that connected modern Haiti to its native history, rooting it to its own soil. So I would say that Neri, the name itself, doesn't necessarily designate King Henry so much as an imaginary leader that is part Cacique Henry, but also part Toussaint Louverture, part Henry, part Dessalines even, a hero of superhuman proportions that is not so much meant to be the king himself, so much as a virtual incarnation of the spirit of Haiti, a mythical epic figure that means to symbolize the achievements of the country for the entire world. In the preface to the play itself, Chanlatte writes the following lines. Such an eternally memorable scene, as the scene described in the play, requires sublime tableaus, which I believe my brush inadequate to render. Yet there remains in my brushstroke something akin to the gold flakes one can see rolling in the sand of the precious brook I designed to utilize. Is there anything that love of country, when joined to the desire to celebrate one's king, cannot accomplish? You may recognize a metaphor here that I mentioned from his pamphlet earlier, the metaphor of the gold rolling in the spring that he uses to paint images, right? So beyond the fact that he's recycling a metaphor that he appears to like, I think it points to very clearly to what Chanlatte believed was the essence of his mission as a Haitian writer, whether it be in pamphlets or in theater, which was to catch the eye of foreign readers with his glittery verse, so that they would have no choice but to recognize the kingdom between the lines, at the detriment, one might argue, of the people. But that's a slightly different story. It's my opinion that, like all the other texts printed at the Royal Press, Neri was meant to be circulated far and wide. It is likely that the collapse of the kingdom in 1820, in the wake of King Henry's suicide, prevented this from happening. Within weeks, after Henry's death, the kingdom was reintegrated into the Republic of Haiti, now led by President Jean-Pierre Boyer. The country, now reunited, could focus on international dealings, most notably with the former colonizer of France. On July the 3rd, 1825, a French fleet arrived in Port-au-Prince harbor, carrying King Charles X of France and his royal ordinance that conceded to the current inhabitants of the French section of Saint-Domingue the full and total independence of their government, on the condition of preferential custom duties for France and the payment of an enormous indemnity of 150 million francs to former French colonists. President Boyer of Haiti accepted the offer, presenting it as a harbinger of better days. But the agreement opened the door to the normalization of diplomatic relations between Haiti and other nations, but it also allowed France to exert exclusive financial domination and shared commercial domination over Haiti, as the debt immediately crippled the country. Opening the borders to France equally affected Haiti's playhouses and theater. For the next 2 decades, original Haitian drama all but disappeared from the local repertoire as Parisian melodrama and vaudeville invaded Haitian stages. It would be another 2 decades, to not until the 1840s, before a new generation of Haitian playwrights would again find in Haiti's revolution material to build a new national theater, also in French. All right, so I want to stop my presentation here. There's a lot of information there. Maybe pause for a minute, give every time to breathe. And maybe that's a good time if you have questions, either on the presentation itself, or maybe we can start talking about Neri and other things. Dr. Lindsay mentioned that you might have questions about archival research, translations, and I'd be very happy to answer anything you're interested in.
Thank you so much for everything you've just offered us. It is so wonderful and brilliant to see all the contextualization that needs to happen in order to understand theater, right? Just like all the history that you gave us. So thank you. I think me and some of my colleagues are totally nerding out over all of that. So thank you so much. I would like to ask about the translation process. In the past, I've had students who could read French and so could read the French version and then read the translation. And as someone who is not a translator, what is that process like for you? How do you make your choices as you're translating a piece like Neri?
So that's it's funny. So I'm just gonna quickly plug this book. You mentioned it earlier. This is Haitian Revolutionary Fictions. I'm one of 3 editors of this book, and a big part of it was translating texts from French, German, Spanish. There's some Italian. I mean, a variety. Hundreds of texts about the Haitian Revolution. So and also plays, right? So we had, I had different variations of the same issue that you mentioned, and I have to say, I mean, I suppose it might not come as a surprise that the two sort of axes of translation are, one, translating the meaning, and then maybe addressing the style. And people tend to, address the two in slightly different ways. I have to say that, to me, and it's probably very subjective here, there's something about that style. The original plays in heroic couplets. It's very neoclassical, right? I mean, that's Chanlatte's style, and that's his main inspiration. He writes in a style that's already out of fashion, right? I mean, at the turn of the 19th century, it's still very much in play, but that's not. It's sort of old, right? And what I noticed as a French reader is that the rhymes are very often very belabored, right? You can almost see him grasping for rhymes, which, again, I by no means pretend to be a poet, and certainly not a better poet than Chanlatte, but still, it's something you can see, right? I mean, there are, sort of, I mentioned that he likes sort of repeating certain metaphors, but you see him repeating certain rhymes as well, right? Some words aren't easy to rhyme with anything, and so you see him sort of reaching at things and tapping into classical names or references to find the rhymes. And that is something that was very often in the back of my mind, looking for English rhymes. So it gets very repetitive to find rhymes for such a long text. And so that was one of the things that I was considering in translating, right? I mean, sort of hovering between the fact that it does sound very old-fashioned. I want to say, obviously in 2022, but I really think it sounded somewhat old-fashioned even when this was first published, right? This is, we have a wave of romanticism washing over Europe, right? It's what's starting to be done on the stage there is already different. And so I had, at least considered, like, how do I render this without necessarily making it sound bad, but, sort of trying to deal with the fact that, yeah, it's stilted, let's say, which is, I would say the same thing about Voltaire's plays, right? But that's exactly it, right? And so, I mean, that was one of the things that was very much on my mind when I was working on the translation. The matter of rhyming in English also is I don't want to speak for hours, but meter in France is very different. And I was born in France. I grew up in France, so my sense of poetry is very French. Meter in France is strictly rhythm, right? There are no inflections like you can like there is in English. It's the amount of syllables. And he writes in Alexandrians, right? There are 12 syllables, and that rhythm I grew up with. Like, that's the one I know best. It's just like I default to it. And that's the rhythm I had in mind in English, and it doesn't necessarily work the same way. That's not, and so, but I felt that that was, maybe a concession that I was more, I mean, for one, I would have struggled with English meter anyway, but I felt like, this is part of the reason why it also sounds stilted in French. So that's another thing. I don't think I respect it throughout, but that's another thing I was sort of shooting for in the translation.
Thank you for that. Yeah, because what I think one of the questions I kind of kept asking and had no answer for is, the French of early 1800s has to be different than the French of today too, right? So students who are learning French today would like those two things are not going to connect necessarily. And so thank you for kind of articulating that even at the time he was writing, he was using some standards.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I was recently teaching 18th century poetry in my class, and in English, but even that's not easy, right? I was teaching Phyllis Wheatley, and some students struggle with the structure of a verse. It's not, the way they reorganize lines, also for rhyming, mind you, it's not always that easy either. So I feel like, the other thing I was sort of hoping to try and render was sort of, somewhat, credible, chronological equivalent in English, right? Like, I mean, some terms of phrases that might sound just as old for English speaking readers.
Thank you. We have another question. How would you characterize a pamphlet writer in today's context?
Oh. That's a really good question. So in the specific case of Chanlatte, but I think this really may apply in different ways and scales, let's say, to the other pamphlet writers at the court of King Henry. In any case, he's everything at the same time, right? This is a man who as a very young man, right, in the 1790s, when he starts getting involved in the revolution, he writes the pamphlets and political declarations for the free people of color militia that he's an officer in. He has a very fiery style, right? I mean, this is the time of the French Revolution, and I mean, it's really impressive how, I mean, again, if you're somewhat familiar with that type of writing, it could have been, it's the style that's very much of its time, and that's impressive, right? It's really, and that's why he's known, right? Like throughout the revolution, I mentioned, right? Like he leaves the island in somewhat obscure circumstances during the revolution, but in 98, he's in the US for a while, and he comes back only after independence. But immediately, Dessalines hires him, even though it's likely that if Chanlatte was involved in the Civil War, he would have been on the other side. Like he was with Rigaud for a long time. Dessalines immediately calls him over, and he stays with Dessalines even when Rigaud's supporters leave, assassinate him, right? Like he stays on that side. But everybody wants him. Everybody wants Chanlatte to write for them. Like when the country splits, both sides want him. He goes to Christophe, but the head Pétion wants him on his side, by his side, right? So he's known as a good writer. And I think to go back to the question, pamphlet writers tend to be Chris Bangi, calls them scribes, right? They're sort of like people, like men of the state, right? They do. Chanlatte writes laws for the empire. He writes official communications. He writes speeches, and then he writes pamphlets, and he writes poetry, and he writes plays. He writes everything, right? And so I think part of the way to consider them, especially in this context, when I think up to 90% of the population probably more were not literate, right? They used to be enslaved. They were not educated. I think people like Chanlatte, whether they want to or not, become writers, right? I mean, I think in this case, he very clearly wanted to. But I think people writing pamphlets are sort of, accumulate roles in this way, right? They in no small part because they're literate. And so I think they all participate in what is very much, as I mentioned several times, part of Haiti's way of defending itself, right? They do this obviously militarily when they have to. They build forts all over the island. They prepare for a potential French attack again. So everybody's also an officer. Chanlatte's a general, even though he would never command troops again. That's his official title. But then everybody sort of works with what they have, and what he has is writing, right? So he writes pamphlets, letters, but also plays when the time comes. Oh, he's also a journalist, but just I forgot to mention this. But he runs the main newspaper in the kingdom for quite a while. So.
That is so fascinating. He was doing so many things, and then it just makes me question why Neri was kind of lost for so long. If there was so much of his work, like I guess if there was so much, that something was bound to get lost. But
well, from what we gathered, and this is really the work that my colleague Tabitha McIntosh, who designed the website with me, did, recovering this play. What we speculate is that his 3 plays were all printed in the last 2, possibly 3 years of the kingdom, right? And what we speculate is that they were actually printed very late in the kingdom period. In fact, so late that they did not have time to circulate very much. As far as we know, there are only 2 extant copies of the play in existence, right? There's one in that one in a library in Belgium, and this other one in a collection in France. And we speculate that they were sent to someone. Someone read it in France, someone read it in England. It ended up in a private collection. But we also speculate that, much like the pamphlets, published earlier, the point was to have them circulate around Europe. But what we also speculate is that they did not have time to send them to more people. So the copies that were made, probably very few of them that actually made it outside of the country, ended up in different places, and some of them ended up in better places than others. So they ended up, being, in different collections and marked and cataloged well enough that people could find them easily. This one, not so much. And it's funny, right? Because people looked for it for a long time, and after Tabitha found it, all of a sudden there was this other copy in Belgium. She looked for it for a while, but the copy in Belgium was in the Royal Library. I mean, it should have been easy to find for people looking for it, but it wasn't. And I think many things sort of conspire to make this, of course, one might say, well, they were in archives, they weren't lost, which is true. They were just sort of not obviously there, right? They were covered. Again, Tabitha makes the argument that, the fact that it was rebound quite literally sort of hid this text from people, because it was collected for its binding more than what it contained, in a weird way. All of this is on the website, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but I think it says a lot also about the way the world has sort of dealt with the artifacts from Haiti in general and from the kingdom in particular. Right, when the kingdom fell, it was pillaged. I mean, literally. Like, we have a text by English observers where they say they went into King Henry's palace and just took anything they could. They took up pieces of the wooden floors. They took up they just walked in there and brought pieces back, right? A lot of it ended up with the local population, but foreigners that were around just grabbed stuff. And some of it we know where it is, and some of it we don't. And some of it pops up along, here and there, and some of it we likely will never find, but is likely in private collections around Europe. So yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. I hear so much of what we talk about in our class around, we use Michel Rolfe-Trio's work, and we talk about the silences, right? And so knowing that it was rebound and not actually lost, but hidden in an archive, right? Like that, the silence that comes there with that, and knowing that it was kind of destroyed by people and just pieced apart and taken, again, the silences of that. But then, right, one of the big reasons why I put this piece in the class and wanted you to come speak with us is because we don't talk about Haitian theater, right? It's not something that is often taught, I think, in theater history classes, and that it's it's an important thing for us to engage with. One of my colleagues kind of wanted to ask, and I'm wondering because I think it relates to how these pieces were written and kind of sent to Europe to kind of circulate there. But how do you see, right, these early iterations of Haitian performance kind of informing contemporary Haitian theater?
So I don't know contemporary Haitian theater well enough to speak about it well. I think I can assume that that there are some connections just from knowing that Haitians are very, very aware of their history and their cultural history. I can say this generally speaking. I don't want to be more specific about things I don't know. One thing I can say, though, and I hope I sort of gave a sense of in my presentation, is that colonial theater in Saint-Domingue is already an international affair, right? I connected this to sort of a long history of blackface minstrelsy and sort of a racial representation in the broader Atlantic. But in the French Empire and beyond the French Empire, Saint-Domingue is second only to Paris. Like, this is what Jean Fouchard, who's worked on the historical Haitian theater, says. Troops would often present plays in Paris and then come straight to Saint-Domingue before they might even go to Bordeaux or other places, which sounds, I mean, to me, it still sounds crazy, right? I mean, imagining that it's not like traveling there was so easy, but the ships would travel all the time. There was a lot more circulation than you might think, I want to say. And when we speak of the theater, that circulation becomes really interesting because it makes a direct line between Saint-Domingue and Paris, so the metropole and the colonies, and then Saint-Domingue opens up on New Orleans, which obviously is French and Spanish, but I mean the cultural connections there are never broken, even after independence, in interesting ways. And so forms of the theater developed and sort of practiced in Saint-Domingue speak to the broader United States, if only by way of New Orleans, but by where everything goes. By way of New Orleans. I mean, New Orleans is the Caribbean, but it's also one of the major ports of the United States at that time. It's sort of the frontier, right? It's not far from what is now Texas, but not yet really. I mean, it's an aside, but working on this, I nobly found out about. You always hear about, well, Napoleon was hoping to come to America at some point, etc. There are Napoleonic soldiers taking over Galveston in the 1810s, right? Like hoping to create their own colony there. The French are there and they do weird things, militarily, economically speaking, but they're also there culturally. And the Haitian Revolution has a cultural impact on the U.S. that I think may be not obvious, but is undeniable. Refugees stream into the US for a decade, from as early as 1791 and all the way into the Revolution. We know a famous one like Audubon or other names that we know as American names that came from Saint-Domingue, but then those actors also did, and then those people came with their own cultural styles and preferences, and they funded local theaters, so on and so forth. So I think it's harder to measure that impact, but I think it's very clear that it existed as well. So I mean, I think a lot of work remains to be done at that level that I haven't necessarily done, that we're starting to sort of scratch the surface. I think for a long time those forms of cultural expression were not really respected outside of Haiti, quite simply. And so I think for scholars around the world outside of Haiti, as we get more and more interested into it, and you sort of see like a chronological development, because nowadays you see more and more interest for the post-revolutionary period. Lots of things happen there. I think as this develops, we'll keep finding, and we'll get a much better sense of exactly how this connects and connected Haiti to the outside world and to the Atlantic world at large.
I find myself reflecting. One, we also read the chapter from Trio Silencing the Past on the unthinkability of the Haitian Revolution and how just the ideas of the Enlightenment created, and you talked about the rights of man. We talked about that in class. We also talked about the rights of women, that de Gouges rights at the same time, right? And just how the structure of thinking could not, in Western thought, could not allow for the revolution to exist, and how that has been trickled down and affected whether we study Haiti or learn about Haiti or where any of that shows up. So good to know that there are lots of people who are continuing to do this work, right? And make those larger connections, because that's one of the cruxes too when we talk about history. Is it's really easy to think that we're way more connected today than we were historically, but there was so much trade that was happening, and not just like in goods, right? But like you said, cultural artifacts and thoughts and performance styles. So thank you for that connection to the US and to New Orleans.
Yeah, I mean, I think along those lines, I just mentioned it, but I know that never stops to surprise me how much people circulated as well. Recently there was a sort of a national debate, or it's still ongoing, because France had the year of Napoleon, which was appalling in many ways, but that's a different conversation. But one thing it allowed, or made sort of necessary, was for people to speak about Napoleon and the years of Napoleon, and what that meant for people like me of French West Indian descent, whose family, ancestors were enslaved because of him, or indirectly because of him, or treated. And one of the things that came about in this national conversation was that there were Black French people in continental France. There were Black French people from the islands coming to France to settle there, to circulate, to travel. Chanlatte himself, his brother, Chanlatte was educated in France. His brother was educated in France during the Revolution. Lots of circulation. And, what that means, and I want to say, for our purpose here, what that means culturally, we don't know. I want to, people, we're starting to figure it out, but it's it goes back to what you were saying. I think many people tend to, there's some pushback on even by some Haitian scholars on Trujillo's idea of the unthinkable, because they don't necessarily agree with this. I tend to think not that they misunderstand it, but that they sort of well, maybe not misunderstand. I think they sort of don't use the full idea, which is that Trujillo is not saying that nothing was written about the revolution. He's saying that there's something about it, even as it happened, that was unfathomable, which is different. There millions of pages were written about it, but as part of the argument I'm making about the theater, for example, Haitians also had to work to present themselves in ways that would be understandable. And that, I think, is also part of what he means by the unthinkable, right? They had to work to make it thinkable in ways that, say, for the French people could finally accept. And what we see, at least at some level, is that the more thinkable it becomes, the more easy it becomes to dismiss, right? By the French, notably. And I tend to think that in no small part, it is because they write in French, for example. I'm not saying there was anything else for them to do, right? But it's a true tragic dilemma. There's no way out of this in some ways. But that, I think, is the very complex part of Trujillo's idea, which is that what it takes to make it thinkable is also sort of a betrayal of what it was at some level. And I think, part of the study of this and the study of the echo and circulation of Haitian ideas and culture is also to try and account with that. Because, again, as that collection I was showing earlier demonstrate, everybody was writing about Haiti, everybody, the entire Atlantic world and beyond, for decades. So if we look at this, we say, well, it was thinkable. Well, but not really, because if you read it, you see those gears grinding, right? Like, what does this place mean? What does it mean? At a time when, increasingly, again, blackness is equated with being lesser than, right? Like, so how do we see the world trying to reconcile things that cannot be reconciled, basically? So anyway.
Yeah, and I heard some of that in your connection earlier, and I'm so glad that you went over that, of that pseudoscience, that's the scientific racism of the time, and how that absolutely affected who was seen as human, but also the complicatedness within Haiti of how it's a connection of race and class and whether you're enslaved or free, but also language, and how all of that just kind of creates a complexity, right, that we have to untangle in order to really understand.
Yeah, when there's a very infamous French article from the 1840s, I believe, written by a former French ambassador to Haiti, when he started sort of a survey of Haitian literature. It's called La littérature jaune et la littérature noire. So yellow, as in mixed race literature, and then black literature. And it is the most dismissive thing you'll ever read, right? It's pretty bad. And what's interesting is that he judges. I mean, he has no qualms in judging Haitian literature by French standards. That's the way he sees it. And so when he talks about Chanlatte, he also says, well, he's writing in the at the heart of the Romantic period. So yeah, Chanlatte definitely looks very old at that point. But everything he says is along those lines. And I think we have to consider to what extent that's made possible, precisely because Haitian literature is in French. And it is a time when, the 40s is when it starts changing, but for as I mentioned at the very end there, for 2 decades there, even Haitian authors are glad to look at France as sort of the reference. We see very similar conversations in the US around the same time about whether or not there is such a thing as American literature, if American literature is sort of provincial English literature. It goes well into the 19th century. There's something akin to that going on with Haiti, with an added layer of race, and that changes everything, right? And so, and that layer is not just one layer, as I mentioned, right? I mean, there's the idea that mixed race people are maybe somewhere in between, and not everybody agrees with this. I mean, again, it gets really complicated. But I think, again, like, it's a necessary. That complexity needs to be taken into account if we're going to, assess this correctly. And I think for a long time, it was not done outside of Haiti. And I really think, again, the past few decades have seen major changes in the way scholars approached these texts and themes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm checking to see. One question that I had as you were, talking about all of the history and context, I don't believe, and you can catch me if I'm wrong, I don't believe I heard you speak of any women. Were women allowed to perform? Were they writing plays? What were women doing in Haiti at the time?
So there were women performers, even in colonial times. There was notably a singer and actress called Minette, who has been written about quite a lot. Which one is it? I'm terrible in contemporary Haitian literature, so for those who know, I apologize. But there's a famous novel by Marie-Vieux Chauvet, and I think it's the Dance on the Volcano, about that, at least speaks about this character. She was very well known, like a very, very successful career. I think, I can't remember her exact trajectory, but she's again, there's a lot of documents about her. We don't know, in any case, I do not know if women were writing plays at the time. The few plays I mentioned are basically the only plays we have for that time period until the 1820s. There are plays that we have from the Republican side that I did not mention, quite a few. But all in all, it's a fairly small corpus that we do know from newspapers and other writings of the time that many, many more were being performed. We just don't have records of them. Even that play I mentioned as being, considered the oldest Haitian play, the one, the copy that everybody uses was actually printed in the 1840s from the original manuscript. So, it's fairly rare because most of those plays would not have been printed. They probably were, the texts were probably manuscripts to begin with. And, again, not that much was being printed until, the kingdom had its own printing press and so on and so forth. So we only can speculate from in like secondary documents. I'm gonna say it seems clear that there were women on stage. Again, just the list of actors for the royal troupe shows that. Chanlatte's wife was a musician who would also perform and sing. There are other women's names in that list of actors. So we do know that much, but I'm afraid we don't know much more.
Yeah, as I teach theater history, women fade in and out of the storyline. Thank you. One of the things one of my colleagues, Emily Raleigh, Dr. Raleigh, kind of connected even as you were talking was the similarities between what Chanlatte was doing and Haitian writers were doing and what Sor was doing, in that kind of idea when she was writing in Mexico, of using the theater as a way of articulating the humanity, right? She was trying to talk about the humanity of the indigenous people, and just then like kind of seeing these connections of people who are colonized and experiencing colonization from European powers, using theater as a way of, no, like we're human too, right? And so just like being able to see those kind of connections between different groups has been really, really great.
Yeah, I think, what's interesting, I mean, again, the good size and bad size to everything, I guess, but what's interesting about how rooted these authors and their culture is in French culture is that I think, certainly Chanlatte and others, I don't think they feel they had to demonstrate that at all. What I think, and I know what you're talking about, I think they do this for other people, right, in their place. So, for, Valentine, Marguerite, and for, the common people, but they're not the common people, right? And, Chanlatte is not. As far as he's concerned, I think there's actually a very, very bold approach to this, by which he says French culture, not only French culture is French culture mine, but I can do it better than you. Right, and and the format that I mentioned, the opera vaudeville, right, that sort of recycles French songs. The way he changes the lyrics, for example, what songs he uses to what purpose is just hilarious. And I mean, that's part of the point. It's supposed to be funny to people at the time. And I think, it's not always clear to me, obviously, why choosing certain songs might be funnier. But in a few cases, it is, right? And he uses, for example, the unofficial national anthem under Napoleon, and turns it into something else, right? I mean, and all of this is sort of, it's not just saying, hey, and they do this in pamphlets, let's say, there's a lot of similar things in pamphlets. I feel like the plays are much more playful, and I think in no small part because, again, the theatrical tradition in Saint-Domingue was well grounded. Like they were all part of it. And they're all familiar with what's being done in France, right? They know all the, they're part of that scene and they know what it's supposed to do. And so when they get to it, they do like really bold things, I want to say, and provocative. And I don't think they, again, they leave that discourse to some extent to something else. The way I tend to see it is that the theater of the kingdom is really like flash, right? Like it's about, putting yourself out there and like putting Haiti out there, saying like, all those things that make people laugh in Europe, we can do it even better than you guys.
Thank you. Do you know if Neri, since it's been translated, has there been any stage readings? Has there been any performances of it?
If there has been, nobody's told me.
Okay.
And I hope they'll let me know if it ever happens. But as far as I know, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just curious. I know it hasn't been it hasn't been long since it's been translated or kind of available for folks, but just curious if people are staging it or reading it at all. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and usually when we kind of start tying this up, we kind of ask more like current reflections from the speaker. So one question that we usually ask is, what are you reading? What are you watching? What is kind of bringing you joy right now?
So I just finished. I just recently read Percival Everett's new novel. I don't know, if there are Everett fans out there. It's called The Trees, and again, I'm a big Everett fan. I wasn't that into his previous novel, but this one is a return to form in rather impressive fashion. So I highly recommend it. I mean, even if you don't know Everett, that's not a bad place to start. It's pretty. I don't want to say anything about the plot because it's sort of it's about one thing, but if I say it, it's sort of revealing too much. Like just check it out if you don't mind potentially being a little shocked. What am I watching? I watch too many things. That's a problem. I really do. I watch too many series. And so I finished quite a few lately. I'm trying to think. Brought me joy. I don't know about joy. I was watching Archive 81 on Netflix recently. Just sort of a horror, like one of the genres I like. I thought that was pretty solid. I don't know if I would consider joyful realizing at midnight that maybe I'm not going to sleep tonight. but if that's your thing, I would say that's a pretty cool series to take a look at. What else? I was at a concert last week. That was great. With COVID, it hasn't always been easy to go to live shows of any kind. I went to see a Sunrise Orchestra play and on stage with More Mother and Kelsey Lou, I think, and that was amazing. Sunrise Orchestra, for the most part, are the same musicians that used to play with Sonra back, starting in the 60s. The main, I don't know if I should call him the conductor, but like the main instrumentist is 93 years old. And this was one of the most, I don't know how to say, active, boisterous, joyful concert I've seen in years. Many of the instrumentists on stage are, they're up there. He's 90, but quite a few of them are clearly up in the 60s and 70s, and it was just, I don't know. That definitely filled me with joy. It was, I did not expect it to be so, joyful, and I mean communicatively. It was infectious, and that was great. So again, if you like Sunrise Orchestra, you may have a sense of what I'm talking about, but if you don't, you should check it out. They're not going to be around for a long time.
Thank you for sharing those with us. Our last question, as long as we don't have any more in the chat, I don't think we do. Because we're a university and all of our students, or most of our students, are 18 to 22. If you could give your 18-year-old self some advice, what advice would you give yourself?
Wow. Oh, that's tough. Trying to remember, what was I even doing? Ooh, okay, yeah. Wow, that's that's more difficult than I imagine. Yeah, I think I would tell myself it's okay to mess up. I think I don't think I was unaware of this, but I think I was definitely under the impression that making some mistakes might entirely, destroy certain avenues of my future, let's say. And I don't know about your students. I'm a first generation college student. I mean, my sister went before me, but that's it. So we had no, family reference for this. Like we were just sort of going blind and doing things, and a lot of it worked out, some of it didn't. But we're also led by very, I want to say, somewhat class ethos, right? Like, I mean, there was an approach to education that was passed on by our parents that was very, very, serious stuff, right? Like you have to, for the most part, I think it served us well. And I don't want to blame this at all, but like I think there was a dimension that was very, again, that made it, I don't want to say scary, but like, I think that things I would have done differently, knowing that, that I could fall on my feet, right? Like, rather than try not to fall at all, there are ways that, like, some of these things weren't, it's not that they weren't important, but they weren't necessarily going to be deadly, let's say. So I would say, some of this, I might have approached in a more relaxed way, right? Like, because that's the time to be a bit more relaxed, maybe. Not that it's impossible later, but it's just gonna be different.
Thank you for that. That reflects some of the conversations I feel like me and my colleagues have been having recently, of just, mistakes are okay. It's going to be okay. So thank you so much. Thank you for today and all that you've offered us. This has been so rich. So thank you for sharing your time and your expertise and all of your work with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. This was really great.
Yes. Hopefully we can do something again. So thank you.
Always ready. If you want to do a reading of Mary in French and English.
Yeah. Okay. We can figure something out.
Yeah, I'm not the best of actors, I don't think.
We can find some actors.
Okay.
Thank you so